Hello, I'm Nick Tyrone, neoliberal centrist dad, back with you for a bit. It's been a bit of a pause. I haven't done a video in a few weeks. I have been busy doing with my day job, but also I've been going around the country looking at where there will be local elections. Yesterday they were held, and the mayoral elections and Runcorn, the by-election. So I'm going to talk about all of that. So I'm going to get to that in that order. I'm going to go local elections, mayoral elections, Runcorn, by-election, and then I'm going to talk briefly at the end about the Canadian election. If you want to just jump to the Canadian election bit, I will put the time down below where you can just jump to it. But I would advise you to stay with me for the whole kit and caboodle, because I'm going to try and make this exciting. Well, I'm going to try and make it exciting. More than interesting, exciting. Right, so let's start with the local elections. At the moment, we don't have a lot of results in. A lot of the accounts are not going to be really start flowing in until this afternoon. Obviously, by the time this goes out, most of the results will be in. But from where we're sitting, there's still question marks. But obviously, I can say right now that a clear pattern is there. Just to preface, there's close to 1,600 seats that were contested yesterday across England. We have about 200 results in at the time of recording. And as I say, the pattern's there. So it's essentially Labour doing poorly, but with a sort of idea like, well, they could be doing worse under the circumstances and all things considered. We've got Reform doing unbelievably well and very much verifying that the polling numbers they're putting into the national voting intention are very much real, whether anyone likes it or not. People are voting for them. Actual real people are voting for them in what looks to be great numbers. The Lib Dems are showing some promise. We'll see how that goes across the day. And the Greens doing okay, but you'd kind of think they should be doing better. But that's sort of the Greens at every local election that happens every year. So, yeah, the big story is really Reform. Reform doing massively well, very much. Because that was the big question, really, coming into this are the numbers that we're seeing in the national polls where you've got Reform on 28, 29, is that just a matter of people saying that in the polling, and actually when they actually get into the booth and have to put an X by someone, actually they'll probably go with Labour or Tories or Lib Dems or whoever else that they've gone with in the past, that the Reform stuff in the polling is either noise or people registering a sort of protest while they're giving the poll, but actually it won't materialize. And actually, yeah, what we found, as we often find with polling, despite everybody sort of having a go at pollsters, is that it's actually become true. It's real. The Reform thing is real. I am sorry to say, for those of you who don't want that to happen, that is very much what's happening. And that was very much shown, I believe, in the mayoral contests. Again, at time of recording, some of them haven't come in. Reform were ahead in the Hull mayoral election in terms of the polling. And I think looking at how the other mayoral contests have panned out, it would be quite surprising if they didn't win that, particularly given Reform won in Lincolnshire. Andrea Jenkins was their candidate. And it's not so much that they won. I mean, they were sort of expected to win, and we all sort of thought they will do well. But they won by an absolutely stonking amount. So basically, they beat the Tories by 14 points, which is incredible. I mean, you have to understand that Lincolnshire, traditionally, and for quite a long time, has been a real Tory stronghold. I mean, some of the safest Tory seats, really, in the country were in Lincolnshire. And the fact that actually we're seeing this complete turnaround where they're getting destroyed by Reform this time around is not a good omen for them, for the Conservative Party going forward. I'll obviously talk a bit more about that in a bit. But the other contests actually tell us a similar story. Labour held the other three that have been called. If I'm not mistaken, it's the one in Bristol, the west of England. Doncaster's been called, and there's another one. But anyway, the important bit is Reform have come second in all of them, including the west of England one in Bristol. A very poor showing by the Greens there, who certainly would have expected to be very close to winning. And in fact, Labour came first, Reform second, and the Greens third. And actually, you can imagine if this had been held in a couple of years' time, perhaps when Reform's ground campaign was a bit more together than it is at the moment, then actually we probably could have seen Reform snag it, which really would have been incredible. I mean, if you can imagine, I know it's a larger area than just Bristol, but essentially you're talking about Bristol having a Reform mayor. And that was actually only a few thousand votes from happening. And that one, almost in terms of any of the other results, even Lincolnshire, is the one that really makes me think about the kind of inroads that Reform are making. I think one of the big things that I think is such a danger for the other parties with Reform is what we're seeing is Reform can win in the towns. I mean, we're not really seeing it in the cities as yet, so that's fair enough, but they can win in towns, large towns as well, and they can win in the countryside. So they can kind of park their tanks in traditional Labour territory and traditional Tory territory, although what those mean anymore, I'm going to get to in the next section when I talk about Runcorn. Now, Runcorn is the one I feel I have the most authority in terms of talking about. I mean, I've seen some stuff around the country. I've been traveling around the country. I've seen some local election stuff. But I spent the weekend in Runcorn, the one just gone. And that was very interesting in terms of what I learned and what I think I can relay to you now in terms of what happened with the by-election. So just to recap, the by-election result is a sort of mind-blowing one in many respects. Reform won it. It was first called at about 3 a.m. that Reform had won the by-election by 4 votes. Yeah, I mean 4, as in 4 votes. That's how close it was. Labour obviously demanded a recount. Any other party would, obviously, in that situation. I mean, 4 votes, you're going to go for it. And the recount came back, and it sort of reminded me, there's a kid's book I used to read to my little ones when they were tiny. It was called Vote for Duck. And in Vote for Duck, there was always this thing where everybody demanded a recount, and then they found 2-3 ballots stuck to a pig's bum or something, and it always just all it did was Duck won by 2 votes, and they had a recount, and then Duck won by 10 or whatever. Well, it was very much Vote for Duck time, and Reform ended up winning by 6 votes. So two extra votes for Reform after the recount. I think. Well, there's several things. There's so much to say about Runcorn, and I'm going to try and be as succinct as I can. One thing to say is Keir Starmer did not come to the constituency. Whether that would have made a difference or not is always, you can't play the counter-narrative, but I would say that he probably should have shown up, I really think. I don't know why he didn't, and I think it's a bit odd, because I don't think he saves any face by having knock-on and losing. I don't think there would have been some question mark if he'd gone and they'd still lost. So I think he should have just gone for the day, because I will say that I know Farage made at least one visit because everybody talked about it in the town. When you were talking to people about the by-election, it was very much political reportage. Lots of people had no idea what was going on or were completely uninterested, but the people that you spoke to who were in any way engaged in it tended to mention whoever they were voting for. Oh yeah, Nigel Farage came up here, and we really respect that, and that's that's a great thing. Really haven't seen any big Labour or Tory people, and we've really noticed that. So I can say from being on the ground, people in Runcorn did notice that Farage came and Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer did not, and it's worse for Starmer because the Tories had no shot. They weren't even close. In fact, they did appallingly badly. They got about half the vote they did in the general election percentage-wise. I don't know in terms of sheer numbers. It would be given turnout, it would be a lot worse than that. But everybody knew the Tories had no shot. Whether they kind of laid low to let Reform win or not, I doubt it, because that would be stupid. But then again, the Tories are doing kind of stupid things at the moment, so maybe that was the plan. I don't know. But with Starmer, it was always going to be close, right? We knew that was the thing that we knew, was it was going to be Reform Labour, and it was going to come down to the wire. That was what everybody sort of assumed. So why Keir Starmer didn't make an appearance in Runcorn, I don't know. So that's the first thing to get out of the way. The other thing that I learned on the ground, and again, this comes when I think about the 6-vote margin of victory. I was there on a weekend. It was the weekend before polling day. So that's significant. It wasn't just like it was in the middle of the campaign. It was the final weekend. And Reform just seemed much more energized. There seemed to be a lot more activists on the ground. The ground campaign just seemed more ambitious, frankly, than the Labour one, which seemed a bit lackadaisical. I mean, people were saying, oh, well, Labour had 400 people out on the ground today. I mean, I'd sort of expect that on the day of a by-election, but I'd also expect, I'd expect a good contingent of Labour people. And I want to be clear about this. It wasn't just like I just hung around in the middle of the town and didn't see a Labour person and scoffed at it. I mean, I drove up and I actually drove around the whole town. And it's not that big a town. And in fact, even when you encompass the suburbs and this, there's sort of satellite towns in Cheshire, south of it, which are in the constituency, like Frodsham, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, which I went to, has a really lovely high street. It is also where the disgraced MP, Mike Amesbury, the reason that they were having the by-election, that's where he lamped his constituent, thus leading to his arrest and the by-election. But Frodsham, yeah, very lovely. And I think, and even still, I saw some Labour stuff in windows, didn't really see any activists. And you can say, well, you were there for a couple of days, maybe if you were there. I'm sure that's true. I would just stress again, final weekend before a by-election, it kind of felt a little bit lackadaisical from Labour. And again, when you lose by 6 votes, kind of counts. So I think there's lessons for Labour to learn there. I felt going into it that a big contest that this was going to kind of throw up was, can Reform, coming from kind of almost nowhere, they were, let's bear in mind, if you go back this time last year, they were at 5% in the polls and were really nowhere. And they've had this huge gain in popularity, this huge gain in their polling, leading the polls. I mean, granted, in a situation where both Labour and the Tories are sort of historically unpopular, but nonetheless leading the polls, come from that 5% in a year. And the question was, well, we know they're going to be, they're going to throw everything at it. They're going to get their activists there. They're going to try and do things. But one of the things to mention, like if I go back to UKIP, the UKIP days, a great example was 2013. So I'm going back a ways, but stick with me. It was the Eastleigh by-election, and that was because a Lib Dem MP had stepped down. There's probably a really great reason why. I think it was Chris Huhne. Maybe it was that whole thing where he went to prison. I'm guessing. But I remember the by-election itself, where it was very much a Lib Dem versus UKIP sort of idea. So you didn't really see a lot of Tory or Labour on the ground. Mind you, a lot more than I saw in Runcorn on the weekend, but I digress. And UKIP threw a lot at it, and they had a lot of energy, and they had a lot of activists, but there were rumours about things like UKIP knocking on doors that weren't in the constituency and stuff like that. A sort of amateurish approach. And was that going to taint Reform this time? I mean, I know there's been this move to try and professionalize them, but were they going to be caught in that? And so it was going to be this like sort of the energy and the the sort of ubulance of what Reform could have on the ground versus, I think, sort of an inbuilt Labour core vote. Like, were people who just vote Labour reflexively, were they going to turn out? Were they going to vote? And would that be enough to get over Reform? And as it turns out, no, it wasn't by, again, 6 votes. So I think that really throws up for me the interesting thing going forward in terms of this Parliament, which is really, I think it's going to be how much can Reform really hone their ground game? How can they pull off what they've done this time around on the ground? And how much does that bump up against a sort of core Labour vote? And what's the dynamic between that? Who wins in the end? And particularly when it comes to the general election, which I think increasingly that will be the narrative of the general election, Labour versus Reform. I mean, the Tories are now in a place where they are very quickly becoming irrelevant. And in my next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So either stay tuned for that, or obviously when you watch this, click on that one. But they're fast becoming irrelevant in the national story in a way that is going to start to seem... it's going to start to seem bedded in a way that will be very difficult for them to just reverse out of before the general election. So that's where I think we're headed. And that's either, you either think that's great. Maybe some of you are very happy about the sort of death of the two-party system, which I think we've genuinely reached at this stage. Maybe that's premature. Maybe Nigel Farage gets sick of it all and quits, and Reform start to fold, and the Tories finally start doing things that don't annoy their potential electorate, and maybe Labour really turn things around, and who knows? I mean, you never know in politics. It just seems like at this moment that the most likely thing is Labour are going to struggle being in government and having to carry the can for that, and that Reform are the outsiders. They're the people who aren't Labour or Tories. One of the things that people in Runcorn told me a lot was, well, it's time for a change. We've had Labour and the Tories have both failed, so let's get some new blood in. Let's get someone in, and actually Nigel, he's our guy, and he showed up in town. You remember that? Did I tell you he showed up in town? So I think that's a big thing that will continue to sort of play. But again, I think it's always worth saying as well that we're not even a year out from a general election. So, in politics is volatile. So who knows? But yeah, I think the Tories are really in trouble. That's my major takeaway. Particularly as one final thing on Runcorn was, I was amazed at how much the town itself, so the centre of town, was very Reform. People just said reform. People were voting Reform. And as you got out of town, as you got into the suburbs and the sort of leafier Cheshire-feeling bits of the whole place, you got more Labour, but not more Tory. The Tories just seem completely squeezed. And I think that's something that could replicate itself. One of the features of the two-party system is you had Labour, back in the day, Labour would have been all over the town. You would have had most of the people in the town itself voting Labour, and then you would have had, as the more you came into the suburbs and the rural or villagey bits of the constituency, that would have been Tory. And now it's strange. Labour are increasingly finding it difficult with the sort of quote-unquote left-behind towns, basically places, particularly in the north, that have a high degree of socioeconomic deprivation, which used to be their patch, but now is very much increasingly becoming Reform. And Labour are more and more becoming the sort of party of the middle classes, with the Tories becoming the party of no one. Anyway, I'll stop beating up on the Tories, and I will now move on to covering the Canadian election result, because this is going to be about election results this week, and we've had... if you're a political nerd, you've been spoiled this week, because not only do you have all the elections in the UK, which have been monumental and almost certainly historic. I think we'll be talking about 2025 and what Reform have done for a long time, regardless of what happens from here. And we had a big federal election in Canada, and I don't have a huge amount to say about this. That's I think particularly original, but I will give it my go. I think the biggest thing is Trump really won it for the Liberals. The Tories were... I mean, I was looking at the polling again. I was really... Because I knew in the back of my mind they were 20 points up at one point, etc. But I went through all the polling last night. And so on January 17th, 2025... right? A few months ago, let's remind ourselves of that, a few days, so 3 days before Trump's inauguration, the Tories were 25 points ahead of the Liberals in the polls. 25. Also worth looking at the fact that the NDP, the sort of left party, were on 18%. So it was really looking like the Liberals were going to get squeezed on both sides, by the Tories and by the NDP. as many of you will know listening to this, that's not what happened. And actually, as Trump got into his rhetoric about Canada as the 51st state, etc., Mark Carney, who became the Liberal leader, was able to very much capitalize on himself as the anti-Trump candidate when that became a popular thing in Canada. And Poilievre really struggled. The Tories really struggled to differentiate themselves and push away, sort of to lose the idea that they were the Trump-friendly party, which suddenly became a real noose around their neck. And they couldn't do it. And actually, one of the strange things is the Tories didn't do badly, as in they increased their vote share. But obviously under first past the post, that doesn't really matter because it matters how many seats you get. And the Liberals were completely able to squeeze the left vote. So they were able to completely squeeze the Bloc Québécois vote, but much more significantly the NDP vote. So the NDP were on 18% around the time of Trump's inauguration. And they ended up with a mere 6% of the vote. They got squeezed down to only 7 seats. So basically, in pure psephological terms, the left vote in Canada just coalesced behind the Liberals, basically to keep the Tories out, and it worked. And I think an interesting thing to wrap up on here is, what can Labour learn out of that? What can the UK Labour Party learn out of that? Because ideally, they would want to try and pull off a similar trick. Essentially squeeze the Lib Dem vote, squeeze the Green vote, squeeze the sort of left-leaning independent vote, basically by scaring them, and you can see it in some of their messaging already, scaring them into, well, if you don't vote for us, it's going to be reform, it's going to be Nigel Farage, and it's going to privatize the NHS and whatever else. Again, the election is not going to be probably for 4 years, so that's a long time, and bear in mind, Trump, unless he finds some way around the Constitution, which things are so crazy, I guess you never know. Trump, the weirdest thing, actually, now that I think about it, is if Trump had somehow managed to subvert the American Constitution and get himself a third term, that would be really helpful for not only Starmer, but center-left parties across the West, because Trump's still there as a threat, and actually a worse threat in a sense, because he's managed to essentially he will seem much more dictatorial, as it were, if he gets a third term, because he will have had to have subverted the U.S. Constitution in quite a major way to have pulled that off. So weirdly, if Trump is still there in 2029, when presumably Labour will want to hold an election. They might want to do it earlier, but things would have to change quite significantly for that to be the case. Then they'll be hoping for Trump to be there. But if not, and we have to assume that probably all things likely, Trump won't be there. What's the boogeyman? How do they scare people away? And will it be enough? And I don't know. I think we may be headed towards a reform majority next time, or a reform minority being propped up by the Tories or whoever else. Anyway, on that cheery note, I will end things. Thank you. I'm Nick Tyrone, neoliberal centrist dad, and thank you to the Bloomsbury Institute, Bloomsbury Radio, for hosting, as always. Thank you to Barra Fitzgibbon, my producer, and we'll see you shortly. Thank you very much.
I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feel, and I'm happy again.